My name is Paige Clark. I am 42 years old, and I run a high-end floral studio in Portland, Oregon. 2 weeks ago, my 16-year-old daughter Avery spent 40 hours baking a 3-tiered lemon elderflower cake from scratch for my mother's 75th birthday party at the Lake Oswego Country Club. And at 8:15 p.m., in front of 40 guests, my mother picked up that cake stand, slid the entire dessert directly into a catering trash bin, and looked my daughter in the eye. "This is a catered black tie event," she said. "You do not belong at this table with a messy amateur project." Avery did not cry. She did not argue. She just untied the white apron she had been wearing to protect her dress, folded it neatly over the back of a mahogany chair, and walked out of the banquet hall into the cold rain. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene to ruin the birthday toast. I did one quiet thing that night instead. And by 8 o'clock the following Tuesday morning, my mother was standing on my front porch, clutching a certified legal document, begging me not to dismantle her life. Here is what she did not understand about that night and about the 10 years of secrets that paid for it. Welcome to QT Told Stories. This channel is where quiet women finally put down the burden of keeping the peace. Every story here is about someone who swallowed their anger until they found something sharper. If you have ever been the invisible safety net for a family that takes you for granted, drop a comment below. Tell me your age and where you are listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Now let me take you to the reality of my family. Run a luxury floral boutique for a decade, and you learn a lot about presentation. You learn how to arrange orchids and peonies to hide the wire holding everything together underneath. My mother, Beatrice, was the human equivalent of that arrangement. To the outside world, she was a Lake Oswego socialite with a waterfront condo and a platinum country club membership. To me, she was a liability. I was the wire keeping her life intact. For my entire adult life, I operated as the unacknowledged maintenance staff for the family image. My older siblings, Caroline and Preston, were the executives. They arrived at holidays in leased luxury cars, blissfully unaware of the mechanics required to keep the lights on in our mother's curated world. When my father passed away 10 years ago, he left behind a mountain of debt that only I saw. My siblings mourned the man. I managed the math. Avery knew none of this. My daughter is a quiet, observant teenager who speaks through acts of service. She hopes to attend culinary school. When Beatrice's 71st birthday approached, Avery spent $240 of her own babysitting money on vanilla beans, elderflower liqueur, and organic lemons. She spent a week researching my mother's favorite childhood recipes. She just wanted to earn a place at a table that was never built for her. I had no idea I was watching her walk into a trap I helped build. To understand how a grandmother could look at a 16-year-old girl and throw her heart into the garbage, you have to understand the operating system of my family. Growing up, my mother did not run a household. She ran a public relations firm where her children were the primary assets. Image was not just our currency, it was our religion. There is a specific memory I carry from my childhood that explains the fundamental truth about Beatrice. I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen island, watching her flip through a glossy issue of Vogue magazine. The doorbell rang. It was a collection agent holding a clipboard. My mother did not flinch. She did not panic. She simply took the bright pink past-due electric bill sitting on the counter, slipped it between the pages of a high-fashion spread, closed the magazine, and went to answer the door with a perfect, practiced smile. She smoothly told the man he had the wrong address. She would rather sit in the dark than let a stranger know she could not afford the light. That was the playbook. And in that corporate structure, my siblings and I were assigned very specific roles. Caroline and Preston were the polished executives. They were the ones who attended the right schools, married the right people, and bought the right imported cars on credit they could barely manage. They were loud, shiny, and expensive. I was the maintenance staff. I was the quiet middle child who opened a floral business, wore sensible shoes, and fixed the leaks before anyone else noticed the floor was wet. 10 years ago, the pipes burst entirely. When my father died, the family mourned a successful businessman. They stood at his funeral in designer black coats, receiving condolences from the local elite. I was the one who sat in a sterile lawyer's office 3 days later and looked at the actual ledger. My father left behind a staggering mountain of hidden debt. The sprawling Lake Oswego lifestyle was a mirage built on zero equity and maxed-out credit cards. The bank was preparing to take everything. Caroline and Preston cried at the funeral and then went back to their expensive lives, assuming our mother was financially secure. They did not know that Beatrice was 60 days away from total foreclosure and public ruin. I could have let the illusion shatter. I should have let it shatter. It would have forced my mother to face reality. Instead, I did what I was trained to do. I cleaned up the mess. I used the profits from my floral studio to quietly purchase a luxury waterfront condo in Lake Oswego under my business, LLC. I moved my mother into it under the guise that she was downsizing for convenience, a narrative she eagerly sold to her friends. For a decade, I have paid the $6,200 monthly mortgage. Every single month, the money leaves my commercial account and sustains the fiction that Beatrice is an independent, wealthy widow. I wake up at 4 a.m. to arrange centerpieces for demanding brides, standing on a concrete floor until my feet ache, so that my mother can sit on a balcony I own and sip wine I paid for. I covered her country club dues. I funded her luxury car lease. I became the silent underwriter of her arrogance. And the tragedy is, I convinced myself I was doing it out of love. I thought bearing the burden alone was the noble thing to do. That silence, that endless financial enabling, is the exact poison that seeped into my relationship with my own daughter. 3 weeks before the 70th birthday party, the cracks in my careful system began to show. I was standing in my kitchen trimming thorny rose stems for a weekend order when Avery came downstairs holding a vintage recipe box she had found at a local thrift store. She told me she wanted to bake the cake for her grandmother's party. Not just any dessert, but a lemon elderflower tier, the exact flavor Beatrice always claimed her own mother used to make during the summers. Avery is not naive, but she possesses a dangerous amount of empathy. She noticed the cool distance between us and Beatrice. She saw how her grandmother favored Caroline and Preston's loud, boastful children, handing them cash while giving Avery polite nods. Avery believed with the pure logic of a hopeful teenager that enough sugar and effort could bridge that gap. She wanted to earn her place in the family hierarchy through sheer devotion. I called Beatrice that afternoon to pitch the idea. The response was immediate and chilling. Over the phone, my mother's voice sounded like ice cracking against a glass. She told me the Lake Oswego Country Club had strict rules about outside food. She said a homemade cake would look rustic, and rustic was just another word for cheap. She hesitated for 10 full minutes, listing every reason why my daughter's gift would ruin the aesthetic of her milestone event. She complained about potential crumbs on the tablecloth. She worried the frosting would lack a professional sheen. She suggested Avery could perhaps bake some muffins for the catering staff instead. Instead of hanging up, instead of telling my mother that she was being cruel, I negotiated. I promised the cake would look pristine. I begged for my child to be allowed to show her love. When I hung up the phone, Avery was standing in the doorway, holding a whisk. She asked what Grandma said. I looked at my sweet, hardworking teenager, and I lied. I translated the cruelty into something digestible. I told Avery that Grandma had very high standards for the event, but she was eager to see what Avery could do. I played the peacekeeper. I handed my daughter the loaded weapon that would eventually be used against her. Avery went to work with a dedication that breaks my heart to think about now. She took $240 of her own hard-earned babysitting money and bought Madagascar vanilla beans, imported elderflower liqueur, and organic citrus. She did not ask me for a single dime. For the next 3 weeks, she spent 40 hours in our kitchen. She baked test layers until the sponge was light and perfect. She practiced spinning sugar into delicate floral shapes, burning her fingertips on hot caramel just to get the petals exactly right. She drew sketches of the piping design, staying up past midnight to perfect the geometry of the borders. She wanted the presentation to rival any professional bakery in the city. I watched her wipe sweat from her forehead, her white apron stained with lemon zest and flour, believing she was building a monument that would finally make her grandmother proud. I acted as the enabler, keeping the illusion intact, setting my daughter up for a catastrophic emotional fall, just to protect a 70-year-old woman who did not even pay her own rent. I thought I was protecting Avery by softening the truth. I did not realize that fluency in my mother's toxic language is its own kind of blindness. The real problem was not the recipe. The real problem was that the guest list was already being manipulated, and Beatrice was about to use the seating chart to put us exactly where she thought we belonged. By Tuesday evening, our home smelled entirely of vanilla and toasted sugar. Avery had claimed the kitchen island as her staging ground, measuring dry ingredients with the quiet intensity of a scientist. She was exhausted, yet her face held that specific bright hope of a child who believes hard work is the universal cure for indifference. I was standing by the sink, washing a stack of mixing bowls, when my iPad chimed on the counter. It was a notification from the family group chat. I dried my hands and tapped a screen. The message was from Beatrice. It read, "Darlings, I have wonderful news. I just secured an emergency booking with La Patisserie for Saturday. The dessert presentation will be flawless. I know everyone was worried about having a proper centerpiece." I stared at the glowing screen, feeling the cold weight of the words. Beatrice knew Avery was baking. We had discussed it. She knew her granddaughter had spent her own savings and her entire weekend preparing for this exact moment. Yet she announced the bakery order to the entire family as a rescue mission, framing my daughter's gift as a disaster she narrowly avoided. I stepped out of the kitchen, walking into the hallway where Avery could not hear me, and dialed my mother's number. Beatrice answered on the second ring, her tone bright and breezy. I did not bother with pleasantries. I asked her why she was ordering a commercial dessert when her granddaughter was already providing one. Her sigh drifted through the receiver, carrying the familiar texture of practiced condescension. "Paige, we talked about this," she said smoothly. "The country club is elegant. A homemade cake is sweet for a weekday dinner, but Saturday requires a certain polish. I cannot have my friends looking at a lopsided amateur project." I gripped the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. I told her Avery had been practicing for weeks. I told her the cake was professional quality. Beatrice cut me off with a sharp, impatient click of her tongue. "She can bring it as a backup for the staff," Beatrice replied. "They always appreciate leftovers in the kitchen. Just have her box it up. We will serve the real dessert to the guests." She hung up before I could reply. I stood in the hallway, the dial tone buzzing against my ear, trying to formulate a gentle way to break this news to a 16-year-old girl. I took a deep breath, pasted on a neutral expression, and walked back into the kitchen. I was too late. I had left the iPad on the counter, its screen still brightly displaying the group chat. Avery was standing over the marble island, looking directly at her grandmother's message. If she had cried, it would have been easier. If she had thrown her mixing spoon or shouted about the unfairness, I could have comforted her. Instead, Avery did something much worse. She went perfectly still. She read the words, absorbed the rejection, and filed it away as a confirmed reality. She looked up at me, her eyes dry and wide, and she did not complain. "I guess I just need to make it look better," Avery whispered. She turned away from the screen and walked straight to the pantry, pulling out heavy bags of refined sugar. She spent the next 4 hours creating intricate spun sugar flowers. I watched her dip a metal whisk into boiling caramel, flicking delicate threads of molten sugar back and forth across a wooden dowel. She burned her fingertips twice. She ran her hands under cold water, dried them, and went right back to the stove. She was trying to outwork a rejection that had nothing to do with her skill and everything to do with her grandmother's ego. That is when David walked through the front door. My husband is a high school history teacher. He spends his days analyzing centuries of human conflict, explaining treaties and tactical retreats to teenagers. Yet in his own living room, his only strategy has ever been appeasement. David is a good man, but he is fundamentally terrified of discord. When he walked into the kitchen and saw our daughter nursing burnt fingers while desperately spinning sugar, he sensed the tension immediately. He pulled me into the laundry room and closed the door. I explained the group chat. I told him about the phone call, the bakery order, and the insult about the catering staff. I expected him to share my outrage. I expected him to say we should confront Beatrice together. Instead, David rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the floor, and delivered the sentence that has kept toxic families functioning for generations. Just let it go, Paige. It is one night. Do not trigger your mother's anxiety. I stared at him, feeling a sudden sharp distance open up between us. Anxiety. That was the word David used to excuse manipulation. He framed Beatrice as a fragile woman who needed accommodation, rather than a controlling matriarch who demanded submission. She wants our daughter to feed her cake to the busboys, I said, my voice low and tight. You want me to let that go? David sighed, adopting the reasonable, soothing tone he used to de-escalate arguments. He said we could not change who Beatrice was. He argued that making a scene would only ruin the party and make Avery feel worse. He told me to keep the peace. I looked at my husband and realized the profound toxicity of the peacekeeper mindset. Keeping the peace always requires someone else to go to war with their own self-worth. It demands that the most empathetic person in the room swallow their pain so the most abusive person can remain comfortable. David was asking me to shrink our daughter to fit into my mother's preferred aesthetic. The silence in the laundry room grew heavy. I felt the profound failure of my own complicity. For 10 years, I had funded my mother's life to avoid exactly this kind of friction. I had taught David that my family dynamics were something to endure rather than something to correct. Now the bill for that cowardice was coming due, and my child was the one paying it. I did not yield, but I did compromise. I told David we were taking the cake to the country club regardless of the bakery order. I walked back into the kitchen, wrapped my arms around Avery, and told her a half-truth. I told her the cake was beautiful. I promised we would bring it to the venue and keep it safe in the catering kitchen until the end of the evening, ensuring her grandmother would see it. It was a tense, fragile truce. I packed the spun sugar flowers into protective containers. I helped Avery level the lemon tears, wrapping them carefully for transport. We went through the motions of preparing for a celebration, but the air in our house felt heavy, charged, like the atmosphere right before a thunderstorm breaks. I thought I could manage the situation. I thought I could navigate the banquet hall, intercept the bakery delivery, and find a quiet moment to present Avery's hard work to Beatrice without triggering a public standoff. I thought 25 years of handling my mother had prepared me to shield my daughter from her sharp edges. I was wrong. I was operating under the delusion that Beatrice cared about family harmony. I did not realize that the dessert dispute was merely a warm-up. My mother had no intention of letting us blend into the background. She had spent the entire week designing a trap much more humiliating than a rejected recipe. She had drawn up a seating chart. And as we loaded that cake into the car on Saturday afternoon, driving through the Oregon rain toward the Lake Oswego Country Club, I had no idea we were driving straight into an execution. At 6 o'clock on Saturday evening, we pulled into the circular driveway of the Lake Oswego Country Club. The Oregon rain was coming down in steady sheets, blurring the glowing lights of the grand entrance. David parked the car while Avery and I carefully carried her bakery boxes through the heavy double doors. The venue was everything my mother prized. It smelled of floor wax, old money, and imported lilies. We bypassed the main ballroom and handed the carefully wrapped tiers to a sympathetic kitchen manager, securing a promise that the dessert would remain untouched in the walk-in refrigerator until after dinner. Relieved, we walked into the private banquet hall to find our seats. The room was striking. In the center sat a breathtaking 20-seat mahogany table draped in heavy ivory linen and set with crystal wine glasses that caught the ambient light. This was the core table. It was reserved for the elite tier of Beatrice's social circle, the women she played tennis with, and the family members she deemed presentable for public display. I walked around the perimeter, trailing my fingers over the backs of the velvet chairs, looking for our names. I found a beautifully calligraphed card for myself. I found one for David sitting right next to it. I scanned the remaining plates for my daughter. Her name was missing. I turned around, scanning the rest of the room. Tucked away in the far corner, pushed uncomfortably close to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen, was a secondary round table. It was the overflow seating. The linen was basic cotton, and the centerpieces were sparse. There, placed between a high chair meant for my nephews and a seat reserved for the hired event photographer, was a plain white card bearing Avery's name. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I scanned the room and spotted Beatrice standing near the fireplace, holding a flute of champagne, greeting her country club friends with a radiant, practiced smile. I left David by the mahogany chairs and walked over, touching my mother lightly on the elbow. She turned her smile, dropping a fraction of an inch when she saw me. I kept my voice low, asking why her 16-year-old granddaughter was seated by the kitchen doors with the toddlers and the hired help. Beatrice did not blink. She took a delicate sip of her drink and offered a response smoother than glass. "You know how teenagers are, Paige," she murmured, waving her free hand as if swatting away a fly. "They despise sitting with adults. She prefers to be with the kids. She will have much more fun over there." There was no warmth in her eyes. It was a calculated maneuver. By placing Avery at the overflow table, Beatrice had physically removed the risk of an unpolished teenager interacting with her wealthy friends. She had engineered a seating chart that categorized her own granddaughter as a second-class citizen. I opened my mouth to demand a chair be moved. I was ready to pull a seat from the corner and wedge it next to mine at the center table. But before I could speak, I felt a gentle tug on my sleeve. I turned to find Avery standing right behind me. She had heard enough of the exchange to understand the arithmetic of the room. "It is fine, Mom," Avery said quietly. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the hurt I knew she was swallowing. "I do not mind sitting with the cousins. I can help feed the babies." She did not want to ruin her grandmother's birthday. Even after the rejection of the cake, even after being banished to the shadows of the banquet hall, Avery was still trying to keep the peace. She walked away from the grand centerpiece, navigated the maze of elegant guests, and took her seat in the corner. I watched my daughter sit down next to a restless 3-year-old and a photographer who was busy swapping out camera lenses. The physical distance Beatrice had forced between us in that room was a perfect, heartbreaking metaphor for our entire family dynamic. I walked back to my assigned seat and sat down. The crystal glass in front of me felt like a cruel joke. I was permitted at the head table because I funded the woman sitting at the center of it. I bought the clothes she wore, the car she drove, and the roof over her head. Yet I sat there, paralyzed, bound by decades of conditioning, watching my beautiful child accept the crumbs of her grandmother's attention. The quiet tragedy of that seating arrangement was abruptly interrupted by a loud commotion at the front entrance. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and my siblings arrived. Caroline and Preston always knew how to make an entrance. They swept into the banquet hall like visiting royalty, laughing loudly and shaking the rain from their designer coats. Caroline is 2 years older than me, and Preston is 4 years younger. Growing up, they were the golden children, the ones who inherited our mother's flair for drama and her desperate need for status. Caroline married a commercial real estate broker who was perpetually waiting on his next big commission. Preston traded stocks, though his primary talent seemed to be losing money with remarkable confidence. I knew the intimate details of their financial ruin because they frequently asked me for bridge loans they never repaid. But tonight, they played the role of the successful, adoring heirs. They approached Beatrice, creating a spectacle for the room to witness. Caroline handed our mother a large, glossy gift bag from a high-end jewelry boutique. Preston followed suit, presenting a flat, heavy box wrapped in silver foil, declaring it was a vintage silk scarf she had admired months ago. "Oh, my darlings," Beatrice cooed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You spoil me. You truly do." The guests smiled and murmured their approval. Beatrice unwrapped the expensive gifts, holding them up to the light, bathing in the attention. It was a flawless performance of wealth and devotion. Sitting silently at my seat, I did the math. I knew Caroline had recently maxed out 3 credit cards to cover her own mortgage. I knew Preston's bank account was frequently overdrawn. Those flashy gifts were purchased on borrowed money. They were hollow gestures designed to purchase our mother's temporary favor. They brought retail items bought on credit, and they were rewarded with the best seats at the mahogany table, showered with praise and gratitude. Meanwhile, sitting in the dimly lit corner by the kitchen doors was my daughter. Avery had spent her own hard-earned money. She had stood over a hot stove for 40 hours. She had created a labor of pure, genuine love. And for her effort, she was hidden away like a shameful secret. The contrast made me feel physically ill. The banquet hall buzzed with cheerful conversation, the clinking of expensive silverware, and the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the background. My siblings toasted to our mother's health, their glasses raised high. I kept my hands folded in my lap, unable to lift my drink. The tension in my chest pulled tighter with every passing minute. We were surviving the dinner service, navigating the shallow waters of small talk, but the real test was approaching. The dessert course was drawing near. I knew Avery was waiting for the moment her cake would be revealed. She still believed that her craftsmanship would win over the woman at the head of the table. I sat there in the flickering candlelight, sick with the realization that my daughter was about to learn a lesson I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. The timeline catches up to the very moment that broke the foundation of my family forever. It was exactly 8:15 in the evening. The main dinner service had concluded, and the waitstaff were weaving through the tables, clearing away the remains of the roasted tenderloin and pouring dark coffee into delicate porcelain cups. The string quartet in the corner of the banquet hall transitioned to a lively, upbeat tempo, signaling that the formal speeches were over and the dessert course was imminent. The room hummed with the low, comfortable chatter of wealthy people enjoying a curated experience. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands resting in my lap, watching the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. I was bracing myself for the arrival of the expensive bakery order Beatrice had arranged. I fully expected to see a towering, generic fondant creation wheeled out by the venue coordinator. Instead, the doors pushed open, and a young server stepped into the soft lighting of the dining room. He was pushing a silver utility cart. Walking right beside him, her shoulders squared and her head held high, was my 16-year-old daughter. Avery was still wearing her white cotton apron over her formal dress. I stopped breathing. I had no idea she was going to do this. I had instructed her to leave her creation in the back to wait until the guests began to filter out before showing her grandmother. But the server, a young man who likely saw a teenager sitting alone by the kitchen doors and felt a pang of genuine empathy, must have encouraged her to seize the moment. He was helping her claim her space. The cart rolled forward, its wheels gliding smoothly over the polished hardwood floor, and the room naturally grew quiet. Conversations faded as the guests turned their heads to look at the approaching display. The cake Avery had crafted was nothing short of a masterpiece. It sat on a heavy vintage glass stand standing 3 elegant tiers tall. The sponge was covered in a pristine, flawless layer of lemon elderflower buttercream. But it was the decorations that drew the eye and commanded the room. Cascading down the side of the pale yellow frosting were the spun sugar flowers Avery had sacrificed her fingertips to create. They caught the ambient light of the chandeliers, shimmering like fragile edible glass. The petals were so thin, so perfectly formed, they looked as though a gentle breeze might scatter them across the room. It was not rustic. It was not cheap. It was a stunning, professional work of culinary art poured straight from the heart of a child who just wanted to be seen. For a brief, suspended second, the guests at the mahogany table were genuinely in awe. An older woman seated next to Caroline let out a soft gasp of admiration. A few people smiled, recognizing the sheer talent required to execute such a delicate technique. Even my siblings, who usually found a way to mock anything that did not come with a designer label, sat in stunned silence. I looked at my daughter. That is the image that will remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. Avery was looking past the cart, her eyes locked directly on Beatrice. My daughter wore a hopeful, terrifying smile. It was the raw, unguarded expression of someone laying their entire soul bare. She was offering her grandmother a tangible piece of her dedication, silently asking if this was finally enough to earn a place in the family. It was the authenticity of the moment that sealed her fate. Beatrice sat at the head of the table. I watched the blood rise into her cheeks, turning her neck a mottled, furious red. My mother did not see a beautiful dessert. She did not see her granddaughter's love. She saw a breach in protocol. She saw a teenager who had defied her direct orders and hijacked the spotlight. Beatrice realized with a sickening clarity that she was losing control of her carefully curated aesthetic. The narrative was shifting away from her milestone birthday and focusing on the quiet girl from the overflow table. Beatrice stood up. The heavy wooden legs of her chair scraped harshly against the floor, a sharp, ugly sound that pierced the soft music. She did not yell. She did not throw a tantrum. Her rage was much colder than that. She raised her right hand and snapped her fingers twice, a sharp, authoritative crack that echoed in the quiet room. She caught the eye of a busboy who was clearing salad plates near the bar. He was holding a large gray plastic clearing bin. Beatrice pointed a manicured finger at the floor next to her chair, commanding him to bring the bin to the head table. The busboy hesitated, looking confused, but he hurried over, holding the plastic tub waist high. The guests watched their smiles fading into rigid lines of confusion. I sat, frozen in my seat, my mind rejecting the geometry of what was about to happen. Beatrice reached out and grabbed the edge of the heavy glass cake stand. She did not hesitate. With one sharp, deliberate motion, she tipped the stand sideways over the gray plastic bin. The 3-tiered lemon elderflower cake slid off the glass. The sound it made hitting the bottom of the trash bin was a heavy, wet thud. The pristine buttercream smeared against the cheap plastic sides. The fragile glass-like spun sugar flowers, the ones Avery had stayed up past midnight to perfect, shattered into 1,000 useless, sticky shards. Beatrice set the empty glass stand back onto the linen tablecloth. She picked up a white napkin and gracefully patted her fingertips, wiping away a stray smudge of frosting. Then she looked directly at Avery, who was standing less than 3 feet away. "This is a catered black tie event," Beatrice said. Her voice was level, projecting just enough to ensure every single person at the mahogany table heard the verdict. You do not belong at this table with a messy amateur project. The room went dead silent. The string quartet stopped playing. The only sound left in the banquet hall was the quiet hum of the air conditioning vents. 40 wealthy, influential guests stared at their plates, paralyzed by the sheer cruelty of the display. No one intervened. No one spoke. I turned my eyes to Avery, waiting for the tears. I waited for her to scream, to knock over the silver cart, to demand an apology for the ruined weeks of labor. But my daughter did not cry. She did not raise her voice. The hopeful smile dissolved, replaced by a chilling, profound emptiness. It was the quiet resignation of a child who had finally learned the rule book. Avery looked at the gray plastic bin, looking at the broken sugar glass scattered among discarded napkins and half-eaten bread rolls. She understood in that exact moment that there was no amount of effort, no amount of talent, and no amount of love that would ever purchase her a seat at her grandmother's table. Avery reached behind her back. Her hands did not shake as she untied the strings of her white apron. She slipped it over her head, folded it neatly into a precise square, and draped it over the back of an empty chair near the cart. She did not look at Beatrice again. She did not look at me. My 16-year-old daughter turned her back on the mahogany table and walked in silence out the double doors, disappearing into the dark Oregon rain. I remained in my seat, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The conflict in the room immediately shifted. This was no longer a battle between an abusive matriarch and a hopeful teenager. The real war was happening inside my own chest. I looked at the empty cake stand. I looked at the folded apron. The sickening realization washed over me that I had funded this very room. I had paid for the dress Beatrice was wearing. I had kept the lights on in the home where she practiced her arrogance. I had brought my child to the slaughterhouse and told her it was a sanctuary. My hands began to tremble, not out of sorrow, but out of an awakening glacial fury. I placed my palms flat against the edge of the table and prepared to push my chair back. I was ready to follow my daughter into the storm. But before I could stand, the people sitting around me, the enablers who had survived this family by looking the other way, began to mobilize. The pressure to swallow the poison was about to begin, and I had to decide right then and there if I was going to choke on it for one more night. The heavy wooden doors of the banquet hall swung shut behind my daughter, swallowing her silhouette into the dark corridor. I placed both of my palms flat against the linen tablecloth, bracing my weight to stand up and follow her. I did not make it halfway out of my seat before a hand clamped around my right wrist. It was Caroline. My older sister leaned across the empty space between our chairs. Her manicured fingers dug into my skin, the sharp edges of her acrylic nails pressing hard enough to leave crescent-shaped indentations. Her face was flushed, her jaw set in a rigid line of panic and irritation. "Do not make a scene," Caroline whispered. Her voice carried the fierce, venomous hiss of a snake protecting its nest. "Sit down, Paige. You will ruin her night. She is 70 years old." I looked at my sister. She was not concerned about Avery walking into the cold rain alone. She was not horrified by the cruelty we had just witnessed. Caroline was only terrified that the illusion of our wealthy, perfect family was about to shatter in front of her country club peers. Preston sat next to her, swirling his scotch, offering a grim nod of agreement. He wanted the disturbance contained so the liquor could keep flowing. I turned my head and looked across the table at my husband. David, the man who spends his days standing in front of chalkboards, lecturing high school students about the anatomy of courage and the mechanics of historical revolutions. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for him to throw his napkin down to take my hand to defend the child we raised. David lowered his chin. He stared intensely at the polished toes of his dress shoes. He remained paralyzed by the gravity of the room, terrified of the social friction, choosing the comfort of the herd over the defense of his own flesh and blood. A profound, chilling realization washed over me, colder than the ice melting in the crystal glasses around us. I sat there looking at the architecture of my own complicity. For 16 years, I had handed my daughter the exact script of submission that I had been force-fed my entire life. I had called it respecting your elders. I had framed psychological abuse as mere eccentricity. I had taught my sweet, empathetic teenager to ingest poison and pretend it was medicine. I trained her to sit quietly while her spirit was dismantled, all to keep a fragile matriarch from throwing a tantrum. I was the enabler. I was the architect of her pain. I did not argue with Caroline. Arguing requires engaging with someone else's reality, and I was permanently done speaking their language. I pulled my arm back, peeling my sister's fingers off my wrist with a slow, deliberate force that made her gasp and recoil. I picked up my clutch from the table. I did not say a single word to Beatrice, who was already signaling a waiter to refill her champagne flute, as if nothing had happened. I turned my back on the mahogany table and walked down the center aisle of the banquet hall. Every step toward the exit felt like the shedding of a heavy, suffocating skin. The string quartet resumed their upbeat tempo, trying to plaster over the tension, but the music faded into a dull hum as I pushed through the exit. The Oregon rain was pouring when I reached the parking lot, hitting the pavement with a steady, rhythmic hiss. The air was frigid. I walked briskly under the dim halogen lamps until I found our vehicle. Through the wet, blurred glass of the windshield, I saw the outline of my daughter. Avery was sitting in the passenger seat. She was staring straight ahead into the dark tree line. I opened the door and slid behind the steering wheel. The air inside the cabin was damp and freezing, yet she had not turned on the engine or the heat. She did not look at me. Her hands were folded in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly against the fabric of her formal dress. The stillness stretched between us, thick and heavy with the unsaid fallout of the evening. I reached out to touch her shoulder, desperate to offer comfort. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, hollowed out and stripped of all its usual warmth. "I am sorry I embarrassed you, Mom." My heart physically shattered. The pain radiated through my ribs, a sharp, suffocating ache. My daughter had just watched her grandmother throw 40 hours of pure love into a garbage bin, and her very first instinct was to apologize for disrupting the aesthetic. She believed the rejection was her own fault. She believed her existence was an embarrassment. I reached across the center console. I pulled her trembling frame into my arms, pressing my face into her damp hair. I whispered the only truth that mattered into the cold car. "You are the best thing in that building. You never have to apologize to those people again. I am the one who is sorry. I am so sorry I brought you here." A few minutes later, the heavy doors of the country club opened. David emerged from the glowing foyer, jogging awkwardly through the puddles toward the car. He opened the rear door and slid into the back seat, bringing the smell of damp wool and cowardly relief into the confined space. I put the vehicle in drive. We traveled north toward Portland in profound, suffocating silence. The windshield wipers beat a steady mechanical rhythm against the glass, clearing the rain away, stroke by stroke. David cleared his throat twice, shifting uncomfortably against the leather upholstery. He was attempting to formulate a diplomatic summary of the disaster, trying to find a way to smooth over the edges of the night. The atmosphere in the vehicle suffocated his attempts before they could even begin. I did not look at him in the rearview mirror. I did not ask for his opinion. As the highway miles rolled past, the grief inside me began to calcify. The tears dried against my cheeks. In their place, a cold, tactical clarity took root in my chest. Staring at the red taillights of the traffic ahead, I began to audit the ledger of my family. I cataloged every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every country club invoice I had quietly covered for Beatrice over the last decade. The quiet woman who kept the peace was dying in the driver's seat of that car. In her place, a strategist was waking up. We pulled into the driveway of our Portland home. I shifted the gear into park and left the engine running. Avery unbuckles her seatbelt, her movements sluggish and exhausted. David opened his door, pausing with one foot on the driveway, expecting me to turn off the ignition and follow them inside to begin the inevitable post-mortem discussion. I kept both hands firmly gripped around the steering wheel. "Take her inside," I instructed him, my tone flat and unyielding. "Make her some tea. Make sure she is warm. I have to go to the studio." David looked at me, his brow knitting together in deep confusion. The rain was soaking into his expensive suit, but he hesitated on the pavement. "Now," he asked, glancing at the glowing numbers on the dashboard clock. "It is late, Paige. Whatever work you have, it can wait until morning. We need to go inside and process tonight. We need to talk about what happened." I turned my head and looked directly at the man who had stared at his shoes while our daughter was publicly discarded. "I have paperwork to finish," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth or flexibility. "It cannot wait." I did not give him the opportunity to debate the issue. I stared at him until he closed the rear door. I watched through the rain-slicked window as he ushered Avery up the front steps, waiting until they were safely through the entryway and the deadbolt slid into place. I reversed out of the driveway and headed back into the city limits. My floral boutique sits in a commercial district that is entirely deserted at this hour of the night. I pulled into the empty parking lot. The storm continued to wash over the dark brick exterior of the building. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It was exactly 11:30 at night. I walked up to the glass storefront, the rain plastering my hair to my neck. I inserted my key into the brass lock, turned the cylinder, and pushed the heavy door open. The familiar scent of eucalyptus, damp earth, and cut stems greeted me in the dark. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I walked straight past the display coolers, navigating the shadows, until I reached my back office. I sat down in my desk chair, booted up my desktop computer, and stared at the bright, glowing monitor. I was not preparing a speech. I was not drafting an emotional text message to the family group chat to demand an apology. Arguments are for people who want to be understood. Arguments require a mutual respect that did not exist in my family. I was preparing an annihilation. The funding of Beatrice's carefully curated illusion was about to end, and I held the sole, undeniable key to the vault. The floral studio was silent, save for the low hum of the commercial refrigerators chilling tomorrow's inventory. I sat at my oak desk, illuminated only by the pale blue glow of my computer monitor. The adrenaline that had propelled me out of the country club parking lot was receding, leaving behind a cold, sharp focus. I was no longer a grieving mother or a humiliated daughter. I was the chief financial officer of my own life, and it was time to audit the accounts. For 10 years, I had maintained a digital partition on my business server. I clicked through the directory, navigating past vendor invoices and seasonal supply orders, until I reached a locked, encrypted folder. It was labeled simply Lake Oswego. I typed in the passcode. The folder decrypted, and the architecture of my mother's illusion populated the screen. The spreadsheets loaded one by one, painting a stark numerical picture of the reality my family had willfully ignored. I opened the primary ledger. Row after row of automated transactions stretched back a full decade, chronicling 120 months of unbroken financial life support. The luxury waterfront condo where Beatrice entertained her society friends did not belong to her. The deed was held by a subsidiary of my Floral Boutique Limited Liability Company. I scrolled down, tracing the outflow of cash. $6,200 every month for the mortgage. $900 in homeowners association fees to ensure the manicured lawns and private security gate remained impeccable. Biannual property tax installments that rivaled the average American annual salary. When I tallied the columns, the grand total hovered just shy of $800,000. I had funneled nearly $1 million of my own labor into sustaining the fiction that Beatrice Clark was a woman of independent wealth. The subsidy did not stop at the property line. I opened the secondary file. It contained the billing structure for the Lake Oswego Country Club. The Platinum membership, the very same membership that granted her access to the mahogany table where she discarded my daughter, was directly tethered to my corporate checking account. Every glass of champagne, every catered luncheon, every round of golf Preston played as her guest was quietly deducted from the profits I earned standing on concrete floors arranging wedding centerpieces. My siblings believed our mother was a savvy widow living off a robust trust fund. Beatrice allowed them to believe it, basking in their admiration, while privately forwarding me the utility bills. She had built a kingdom on a foundation of my silent labor. Now she had used that very kingdom to execute my child. As I reviewed the documents, sorting them by date to prepare the legal attachments, a specific archived message caught my eye. It was an email Beatrice had sent me 8 years ago, shortly after I had moved her into the waterfront property to save her from bankruptcy. I clicked the subject line and read the brief, arrogant text. Page, the email read, I had the interior decorator measure the primary bedroom today. I must say the square footage is quite disappointing. I suppose I will have to make do with a smaller vanity, but it is hardly ideal for entertaining overnight guests. We should look at upgrading next spring. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at those words. 8 years ago, I had read that message and felt a twinge of guilt, wondering if I should have worked harder to afford a larger unit for her. Tonight, reading it through the lens of a mother whose 16-year-old had just been banished to an overflow table, the email crystallized the staggering depth of Beatrice's entitlement. I had rescued her from financial ruin, handed her a luxury estate, and her first instinct was to complain that the free bedroom was not vast enough to accommodate her vanity. She demanded endless space for her ego, yet she could not spare a single square inch of table linen for her granddaughter's handmade gift. The contrast between Beatrice's unearned arrogance and Avery's pure, discarded effort burned away whatever lingering hesitation I held. The emotional warfare was over. The structural dismantling was ready to begin. I did not need to scream cry or post a furious rant on social media. I only needed to stop paying the ransom. I opened my email client and initiated a new draft. I addressed it to Thomas, my real estate attorney, and copied my wealth manager. Thomas had drafted the original holding company documents 10 years ago. He had warned me then that mixing family with hidden real estate assets was a dangerous game. I had ignored him, insisting my mother needed a safe harbor. Tonight, I was proving him right. The instructions I typed were clinical, devoid of any emotional exposition or family drama. Thomas, the message began. Effective immediately upon receipt of this email, please sever all automatic financial transfers and linked accounts associated with Beatrice Clark. This includes the country club membership, the vehicle lease, auto pay, and all utility drafts. Furthermore, draft a formal 30-day notice to vacate the Lake Oswego property. The LLC is taking immediate possession of the asset. Please have the notice sent via certified overnight mail to the residents by Monday morning. Do not accept any phone calls from her or my siblings. Direct all inquiries to me in writing. I proofread the text twice. There were no exclamation points. There were no threats. It was merely a sequence of administrative commands that would systematically dismantle a 70-year-old woman's entire universe. I attached the ledgers, the deed documentation, and the country club billing authorizations. I moved the cursor over the send button. I thought about the gray plastic catering bin. I thought about the delicate shattered spun sugar petals. I thought about my daughter folding her white apron in the quiet resignation of a broken heart. I clicked send. The outgoing message chime echoed softly in the empty studio. The emails vanished into the digital ether, traveling toward servers that would process them into binding legal actions by Monday morning. Beatrice had walked into a trap of her own making, believing the floor beneath her was solid rock, entirely unaware it was a trap door I had been holding shut for a decade. She had spent the evening orchestrating a public execution to protect her aesthetic, never realizing that she had just insulted her sole underwriter. I shut down the computer and turned off the monitor. The studio plunged back into darkness. The storm outside was finally beginning to break, the heavy rain tapering off into a fine, silent mist. I locked the front door of the boutique and walked to my car, my mind already anticipating the incoming shockwave. Pulling the plug on Beatrice would not just ruin her finances, it would detonate the entire family dynamic. Caroline and Preston were going to lose their rich matriarch. David was going to face the exact social friction he had begged me to avoid. The quiet peacekeeper was gone, and the fallout was going to be immediate. The only question left was how long it would take for my mother to realize the bank vault had been permanently sealed. I started the engine, knowing Monday morning was going to bring a reckoning Lake Oswego had never seen. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, the Portland sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. I sat in a leather chair inside the sleek downtown office of my corporate attorney, Thomas. The room smelled of dark roast coffee and expensive binding leather. Thomas had represented my floral boutique for over a dozen years. He was the one who drafted the original limited liability company structures, and he was the one who had strongly advised against purchasing the Lake Oswego real estate under the business umbrella a decade ago. He knew the intricate parasitic nature of my family dynamic better than anyone. Thomas sat behind his heavy walnut desk, looking down at a printed copy of the email I had sent him at midnight. He read the instructions silently, his expression unreadable. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city traffic moved in a slow, steady crawl. He placed the paper flat on the desk and folded his hands. He looked at me with the cautious, measuring gaze of a lawyer who needs to ensure his client is operating with absolute clarity. Page Thomas began, his tone measured and serious. I need to make certain you comprehend the exact magnitude of what you are asking me to execute today. I nodded, maintaining steady eye contact. Thomas laid out the brutal, undeniable reality of the situation. He explained that Beatrice possessed zero equity in the waterfront property. She held no formal lease agreement. She possessed no independent wealth, no savings, and no safety net outside of my corporate checking account. Thomas warned me that severing the automatic transfers and revoking the country club billing authorization would not just inconvenience her, it would result in her immediate, irreversible financial and social ruin. He emphasized that the 30-day notice to vacate was a legal eviction. It would become a matter of public record. Her elite friends would find out. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for her entire life would collapse within 48 hours. He asked me if I was prepared for the sheer scale of the fallout. He wanted to know if I was ready to pull the plug on my own mother. I did not blink. I did not shed a tear. I leaned forward in the leather chair, resting my forearms on the edge of his walnut desk. "She threw my daughter away," I said, my voice carrying the chilling, hollow calm of a deserted building. "I am throwing away her funding." Thomas studied my face for a long moment. He saw the cold, calcified resolve in my posture. He did not ask any more questions. He reached for his silver fountain pen, slid a thick stack of prepared legal documents across the desk, and pointed to the signature lines. I signed my name 6 times. The ink dried on the thick paper, officially ending a decade of silent extortion. By 11 o'clock that morning, the structural dismantling of my mother's universe commenced. I sat in Thomas's conference room with my laptop open, logging directly into the corporate banking portal. It took less than 10 minutes to erase a 10-year lie. I clicked a sequence of buttons canceling the automated draft for the property taxes. I deleted the recurring transfer for the homeowners association dues. I severed the payment linkage for the luxury vehicle lease. Across the room, Thomas's paralegal sat at a telephone holding a copy of my corporate authorization. She placed a formal call to the billing department of the Lake Oswego Country Club. I listened to the paralegal calmly instruct the club administrators to immediately remove my limited liability company as the financial guarantor for Beatrice's Platinum membership. The account was frozen. Any future charges would be declined at the point of sale. The final piece of the execution was physical. Thomas handed me a sealed FedEx envelope containing the formal 30-day notice to vacate. It listed my company as the sole legal owner of the property and demanded the immediate surrender of the premises. The tracking number was printed clearly across the top label. A courier collected the envelope at noon. It was shipped via certified overnight delivery. The document was now a physical projectile, moving through the postal system, destined to land squarely on Beatrice's doorstep by the following morning. The gears were turning, and the machine could no longer be stopped. I closed my laptop, thanked Thomas for his swift execution, and drove back to my house in the suburbs. I arrived home just after 1 in the afternoon. Avery was at school, but David was sitting at the kitchen island grading a stack of history essays. He looked up when I walked through the door, offering a tentative, cautious smile. The tension from Saturday night still lingered in the air between us, heavy and unresolved. I set my purse on the counter. I looked at my husband, the perpetual peacekeeper, and I delivered the news. I told him exactly where I had been all morning. I informed him that the funding was permanently severed, the country club membership was revoked, and a legal eviction notice was currently in transit to Lake Oswego. David dropped his red grading pen. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly shade of gray. His reaction was pure, unfiltered panic. He stood up, pushing his stool back so hard it scraped against the tile floor. He began to pace the length of the kitchen, running his hands nervously through his hair. He deployed every predictable argument in the Enabler's Handbook. "Paige, you cannot do this," David stammered, his voice climbing in pitch. "You are going to shatter the family. She will claim she is homeless. Caroline and Preston are going to lose their minds. This is going to become a massive public scandal. We can talk to her. We can demand an apology for the cake. But putting your own mother on the street? You are going too far." He was begging me to restore the comfortable dysfunction. He was terrified of the social friction, terrified of Beatrice's wrath, and desperate to sweep the public humiliation of our child under the rug, just to maintain a quiet weekend. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. Instead, I unzipped the side pocket of my leather purse. I reached inside and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt. I walked over to the kitchen island and smoothed the paper flat against the granite countertop, sliding it directly in front of David. "I want you to look at this," I instructed him, pointing a finger at the printed text. David stopped pacing. He stepped forward and looked down at the paper. It was a dry cleaning and bespoke tailoring invoice from a luxury boutique in downtown Portland. The total was nearly $400. The date on the receipt was Friday, the day before the 70th birthday party. Beatrice charged the tailoring and pressing of her birthday dress directly to my corporate account, I explained, keeping my tone deadly flat. The dress she wore while she humiliated our daughter. The dress she wore while she commanded a busboy to throw Avery's love into the garbage. She made me pay for the costume she wore to execute our child. David stared at the receipt. The black ink on the white paper laid bare the sheer, unapologetic audacity of the woman he was trying to defend. "She is a parasite." "David," I continued, stepping closer to him. "She feeds on my labor, and she uses that energy to crush anyone who threatens her ego. You want to keep the peace, but the peace you are defending is built on Avery's broken heart." I crossed my arms over my chest and delivered the final, non-negotiable ultimatum. "You have a choice to make right now," I told my husband. "You can either stand with your daughter in this house, and you can help me protect her from that toxic environment. Or you can pack a suitcase, drive to Lake Oswego, and spend the next 30 days living in that condo with my mother before the sheriff locks the doors. But you will not stand in my kitchen and defend the woman who broke our child. Pick a side." The silence in the kitchen stretched out thick and heavy. David looked at the dry cleaning invoice. He looked at the hard, unyielding expression on my face. The history teacher finally understood the lesson sitting right in front of him. He realized that appeasing a tyrant does not create safety. It only emboldens the cruelty. He saw the ugly truth of his own cowardice reflected in that receipt. David slowly exhaled a long, shaky breath that seemed to deflate the panic right out of his chest. He reached down, picked up the receipt, and dropped it into the kitchen trash can. He looked me in the eye, his shoulders dropping in quiet surrender. "I am staying here," David said quietly. "I am with Avery. I am with you." The secondary conflict dissolved, leaving behind a unified front. The passive enabler arc was officially broken. David had finally locked himself into the reality of the war choosing his family over his fear of social discomfort. We stood together in the quiet kitchen, the house feeling strangely secure. For the very first time in our marriage, the internal fractures were sealed. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise on Tuesday morning. The trap was set, the funding was gone, and the target was about to wake up to a world she could no longer afford. The timeline arrived at Tuesday morning. I pieced together the exact sequence of my mother's collapse weeks later, gathering the details from the inevitable Lake Oswego gossip mill and the shattered fragments of her own frantic retellings. Beatrice woke up on Tuesday believing she was still the untouchable matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. She had no idea she was a trespasser in her own life. At 9:15 in the morning, my mother was sitting in the plush leather chair of an exclusive boutique salon. This was her bi-weekly ritual. She required a professional blowout and a manicure to maintain the polished armor she presented to the world. She sat in front of the brightly lit vanity mirrors, sipping sparkling water with a slice of lemon, chatting amiably with the staff about her fabulous weekend and the stunning success of her 70th birthday gala. She conveniently omitted the part where she threw her granddaughter's handmade gift into a catering bin. In her rewritten reality, the party was a flawless triumph. Her appointment concluded just before 10 o'clock. She walked up to the marble reception desk, her hair perfectly styled, exuding the casual arrogance of a woman who never checked a price tag. She retrieved her platinum credit card from her designer handbag and slid it across the counter. The young receptionist ran the magnetic stripe through the terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, negative beep. The receptionist frowned, tapped the screen, and tried inserting the chip. The terminal buzzed again. The receptionist looked up, her expression a mix of professional politeness and mild discomfort. She informed my mother that the card had been declined. Beatrice offered a tight, condescending smile. She assumed it was a routine fraud alert, a minor inconvenience caused by an overzealous banking algorithm. She reached into her wallet, pulled out a secondary gold card, and handed it over, instructing the girl to run it quickly because she had a very busy schedule. The terminal processed the secondary chip. It buzzed a third time. Declined. The atmosphere in the reception area shifted. Two other wealthy patrons, waiting on velvet sofas, paused their conversations, casting sideways glances toward the front desk. For a woman whose entire existence was predicated on the perception of affluence, this was a waking nightmare. Beatrice snatched both cards out of the receptionist's hand, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. She claimed there was a ridiculous banking error dug into her purse and threw enough cash onto the marble counter to cover the bill, storming out of the salon before anyone could offer her a receipt. She drove her leased luxury sport utility vehicle back to her waterfront complex, gripping the leather steering wheel with white knuckles. She was furious, rehearsing the blistering phone call she intended to make to her wealth manager the moment she stepped through her front door. She parked in her reserved underground space and took the private elevator up to her floor, expecting to find the serene, quiet sanctuary she believed she owned. She stepped off the elevator at 10:30 in the morning. Walking down the pristine, carpeted hallway, she stopped dead in her tracks. Taped directly to the center of her heavy mahogany front door was a bright white certified courier envelope. Beatrice ripped the package off the wood, her heart beginning to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She unlocked her door, threw her handbag onto the entryway console table, and tore the cardboard flap open. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The cover page bore the imposing letterhead of my attorney's downtown firm. She scanned the bold black text. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. My mother read the paragraphs detailing the immediate termination of her residency. She read the name of the plaintiff. It did not list a faceless bank or an anonymous landlord. It listed the exact name of my Floral Boutiques holding company as the sole, undisputed legal owner of the property. The documents outlined that her status was merely a permissive occupant and that permission was permanently revoked. As she frantically flipped through the pages, a small square of bright yellow paper fluttered to the hardwood floor. Beatrice bent down and picked it up. It was a handwritten sticky note I had attached to the final page of the eviction notice before handing it to the courier. I had used a black felt-tip pen, writing in crisp, legible print. "This is a catered black tie property," the note read. "You no longer belong here." Any normal human being might have felt a profound sense of shame in that moment. A rational mother might have collapsed onto the sofa, realizing the devastating consequences of her own cruelty, understanding that she had bitten the only hand keeping her from drowning. But Beatrice was not built for remorse. Her immediate reaction was absolute, blinding rage. She felt wronged. She felt attacked. The illusion of her superiority had been punctured, and rather than reflect on the damage she had caused my daughter, her mind instantly pivoted to retaliation. She needed to scream. She needed to unleash decades of maternal authority, to call me and demand I fix this insubordinate mistake immediately. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She tapped my name in her contacts list and pressed the phone to her ear, pacing the length of her sprawling living room while staring out at the gray waters of the lake. The line did not ring. There was a brief click, followed by an automated, pre-recorded carrier message. The mechanical voice informed her that the cellular account had been suspended and all outgoing calls were restricted. Beatrice pulled the device away from her ear and stared at the dark screen. The reality of the severance began to close in around her. The credit cards were dead. The phone was dead. The house was no longer a sanctuary, but a countdown timer. Every luxury she touched was evaporating into thin air. She was standing in a museum of wealth, and the curator had just turned off the lights. The isolation fueled a frantic, desperate energy. She could not call my siblings because she had no functioning phone. She could not send an email because the wireless internet router in the living room, also billed to my corporate account, was displaying a blinking red error light. She was entirely cut off from her audience and her enablers. She grabbed her car keys off the console table and stormed back out the front door. She did not know that the luxury vehicle she was about to drive was currently racking up late fees on a canceled autopay account. She only knew that I was the source of this humiliation, and she was determined to confront me in person to restore the hierarchy. She drove out of Lake Oswego, merging onto the interstate heading north toward Portland. She exceeded the speed limit the entire way, her jaw locked in a rigid line of fury. She rehearsed the threats she would deploy. She would threaten to ruin my business reputation. She would threaten to alienate me from the extended family. She was armed with decades of psychological manipulation, fully confident that I would fold the moment she raised her voice, just as I always had. While Beatrice was tearing up the highway, I was sitting in my living room waiting. Avery was safely sitting in her high school geometry class. David was standing in front of a chalkboard at his school, teaching his students about the inevitable collapse of authoritarian regimes. I had the house entirely to myself. I did not go into the floral studio that morning. I had brewed a pot of dark coffee, poured myself a single mug, and sat in an armchair facing the front windows. The Oregon sky was bleak and overcast, casting a pale, flat light across the neighborhood. I watched the pendulum of the grandfather clock in the hallway swing back and forth, slicing the silence into steady, rhythmic seconds. I knew the courier delivery schedule. I knew the timeline of her salon appointments. I had calculated the travel time between her zip code and mine. I was not hiding behind my attorney's paperwork. I had engineered this timeline specifically to ensure she had to look me in the eye when the vault finally closed. The digital clock on the cable box flipped to 11:44. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against my palms. My pulse was remarkably steady. For the first time in 42 years, I was not afraid of my mother's arrival. I was the architect of the boundary, and the foundation was solid concrete. The digital clock flipped to 11:45. Outside, tires screeched against the wet pavement as a heavy vehicle swerved into my driveway. A car door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the glass in my front windows. Footsteps marched aggressively up the concrete walkway, striking the wooden planks of my front porch. The doorbell rang. The sharp, piercing chime echoed through the quiet house, signaling that the ghost of my past had finally arrived, demanding entry into a future she could no longer afford. The doorbell echoed through the hallway, a sharp brass note vibrating against the quiet walls of my home. I set my coffee mug on the side table. I smoothed the fabric of my sweater. I walked toward the entryway with measured, deliberate steps. I did not rush. For decades, the sound of my mother demanding attention would trigger an instant panicked response in my nervous system. I would sprint to answer the call, eager to intercept whatever complaint she carried before her mood could escalate and ruin the afternoon. Today, I felt none of that old anxiety. Today, I let her wait on the concrete porch. I reached the front door. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt. I pulled the solid wood open. Beatrice stood on the welcome mat. The crisp, polished veneer she meticulously curated for the public had fractured. Her expensive beige trench coat was unbuttoned, hanging awkwardly off her shoulders, exposing a wrinkled silk blouse underneath. The pristine salon blowout she had received just hours earlier was tangled from the wind and the damp Oregon air. In her right fist, she clutched the crumpled stack of legal documents for my attorney. The white bond paper shook visibly against her chest, matching the rapid, furious rise and fall of her breathing. She did not wait for a greeting. She did not say hello. She lunged forward, stepping toward the threshold of my home. She expected me to step backward automatically and yield the space. She expected to sweep into my foyer, commandeer my living room, and begin her tirade from the center of my house, treating my property as an extension of her own domain. I did not step backward. I planted my feet squarely in the center of the doorframe, physically blocking her entry. I rested my shoulder against the jamb, my posture relaxed, but immovable. The role reversal was instantaneous and profound. The woman who had dictated the physical boundaries of every room I ever entered was now halted by my mere presence. "Move out of my way," Page Beatrice commanded. Her voice vibrated with a shrill, arrogant edge. She waved the crumpled eviction notice inches from my face. "I demand you call your lawyer this second and correct this ridiculous clerical mistake. You are going to fix this banking error right now, and then we are going to have a very long discussion about your insolence." She still believed she was the director of the play. She thought I was merely an incompetent assistant who had mismanaged her accounts, a subordinate who needed to be disciplined and directed. She could not fathom a reality where I possessed the authority to end her reign. I looked at the furious, entitled woman standing on my porch. I felt no fear. I felt no residual guilt for the boundary I was enforcing. "You do not belong in this house," I stated. My voice was smooth, carrying the low, even cadence of a judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict. "You will not cross this threshold today." Beatrice froze in her tracks. The authoritative command in her eyes faltered, quickly replaced by a sudden, jarring confusion. She stared at me, trying to process the brazen defiance. Nobody ever told Beatrice Clark she did not belong. She was the matriarch who handed out the invitations. She was the architect who drew the seating charts. To hear her own middle daughter deny her entry into a modest suburban home was a shock to her nervous system. She looked down at my shoes planted firmly on the hardwood floor, realizing I was a physical barricade she could not bypass. When authoritarian commands fail to produce obedience, manipulators inevitably pivot to their secondary weapon. Beatrice shifted her tactics. The blazing anger drained from her face, instantly replaced by the trembling, fragile mask of a victim. Her lower lip began to quiver. Her eyes pooled with sudden, manufactured tears. This was the exact performance she used to extract thousands of dollars from Caroline and Preston. She played the helpless widow, abandoned by the harsh world, relying on the guilt of her children to secure her survival. "How can you do this to me?" Beatrice wept. Her voice cracked with practiced vulnerability, pitching up into a wounded register. "I am your mother. I gave you life. You are abusing an elderly woman. You are throwing your own flesh and blood out onto the street over a silly misunderstanding at a birthday dinner. You are a heartless, cruel girl. I have nowhere to go." She waited for the accusation of elder abuse to land. She expected me to crumble under the weight of the term, to apologize for overreacting to usher her inside, and promise that the eviction was just a temporary scare. She relied on the ingrained societal pressure that dictates children must revere their parents, regardless of the toxicity they endure. I did not defend my character. I did not engage with the label of an abuser. Explaining reality to a narcissist is a profound waste of oxygen. Instead, I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and withdrew my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, pulled up a specific image in my photo gallery, and held the glowing device directly in front of her tear-streaked face. The photograph had been taken by the sympathetic young server in the banquet hall, the one who helped wheel the dessert cart to the mahogany table. He had texted it to me late Saturday night, disgusted by what he had witnessed after the guests departed. The image on the screen was undeniable. It showed the gray plastic catering bin sitting in the fluorescent light of the commercial kitchen. Lying at the bottom, smashed against dirty napkins and discarded food scraps, was the 3-tiered lemon elderflower cake. The delicate spun sugar flowers were crushed beyond recognition. The pristine buttercream was ruined, smeared against the cheap plastic. It was a visual record of undeniable cruelty, captured in high definition. Beatrice stopped crying. The fake tears evaporated the exact moment she saw the picture. She stared at the digital screen, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a way to spin the evidence. There was no spin available. The photograph was a mirror, reflecting her true nature, stripping away the refined socialite facade and exposing the vindictive bully hiding underneath. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The brief silence hung over the porch, heavy with the weight of her exposed actions. "Let us review the mathematics of your current situation," I instructed her, speaking with clinical precision. "You have exactly 30 days to pack 10 years of hoarded luxury into cardboard moving boxes. You possess zero equity in that waterfront property. You have no credit score, no independent income, and no authority over the accounts. Beatrice stood rigid, the crumpled legal documents lowered to her side. The reality of the financial execution was finally piercing through her delusion. If you break a single window, I continued my gaze, locking onto hers, ensuring she understood the gravity of the warning. If you punch a hole in the drywall, if you steal the stainless steel appliances, or if you cause a single dime of property damage on your way out the door, my limited liability company will sue you in civil court. I will garnish whatever meager Social Security checks you collect for the rest of your natural life. Do not test my resolve. The bank is permanently closed. The victim routine was abandoned. The predatory matriarch returned to the surface, her eyes narrowing into cold, venomous slits. If she could not command me and she could not manipulate me with tears, she would resort to the only currency she had left in her arsenal. She would attempt to burn my reputation to the ground. "You think you have won," Beatrice sneered. Her voice dropped to a harsh, ugly whisper filled with spite. "You think you can do this quietly and walk away. I will tell the entire family what you have done today. I will call Caroline and Preston. I will tell everyone at the country club that you stole my home out from under me. I will paint you as a monster to every friend you have in this city. You will be ostracized. Nobody will ever look at you the same way again." She stood there, breathing heavily in the damp air, waiting for the threat of public exile to break my composure. She believed that social standing was my weakness because it was her only vital organ. She thought the fear of being judged by extended relatives and wealthy strangers would force me to surrender the keys to the condo. I looked at the woman who had terrorized my family for decades. I looked at the person who had tried to teach my daughter that her love was worthless. I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was a cold, terrifying expression, born from the unwavering certainty of my incoming victory. "I was counting on it," I replied softly. I stepped back into my foyer, grasped the brass handle of my heavy wooden door, and shut it directly in her face. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud, satisfying click. I stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the muffled sounds of her retreating footsteps, marching angrily back to her leased vehicle. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as she sped away. The satisfaction blooming in my chest was profound, but I knew the quiet peace of the house would be brief. Beatrice was driving away, but she was heading straight toward the digital battleground. The private confrontation had concluded, and the public war was about to commence. I walked back toward the kitchen, calmly preparing for the social media smear campaign that would inadvertently hand me the perfect stage to drop the final guillotine on her remaining lies. The silence in my foyer after the front door closed was profound, but I knew it was only a temporary weather pattern. When a controlling personality is denied a private victory, they will inevitably pivot to seek a public execution. My mother had driven away from my house empty-handed, stripped of her authority and her funding. I knew she would not spend the afternoon reflecting on her behavior. She was going to seek out an audience to validate her victimhood. I walked into the kitchen, poured the remaining cold coffee down the sink, and braced myself for the digital shockwave. It arrived exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. My smartphone vibrated on the granite countertop, signaling a barrage of incoming notifications. I unlocked the screen and opened my social media applications. Beatrice had bypassed sending private messages. She had gone directly to her Facebook page, publishing a sprawling, multi-paragraph status update. She had deliberately set the privacy permissions to public, ensuring the narrative would reach every neighbor, every country club acquaintance, and every extended relative in our social orbit. I stood in my kitchen and read her masterpiece. It was a masterclass in fictional storytelling. She did not write a single word about a 16th birthday. She omitted the gray plastic catering bin, the ruined spun sugar flowers, and the cruel dismissal of my daughter. Instead, she painted a harrowing portrait of elder betrayal. Beatrice claimed that she was currently packing boxes in tears. She wrote that her middle daughter had discovered an obscure, cruel legal loophole to steal the deed to her beloved waterfront sanctuary. She described the condo not as a property I purchased for her, but as the sacred home she had painstakingly built with my late father, a place filled with precious family memories that were now being ripped away by greed. The final paragraph was designed to weaponize the pity of her wealthy peers. She begged her network for urgent prayers. She asked if anyone could recommend a ruthless litigation attorney willing to help a vulnerable widow fight a heartless eviction. She claimed she was facing impending homelessness at 70 years old. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The comments section beneath her post flooded with outrage from the Lake Oswego elite. Women who spent their afternoons playing tennis and drinking overpriced wine rushed to defend the fallen matriarch. They typed out their shock, calling the situation a tragedy. They posted praying hand emojis and offered the contact information for aggressive real estate lawyers. Several women who had known me since childhood left public comments, calling me an ungrateful, vicious child who deserved to be shunned from polite society. The public character assassination was swift and severe. Beatrice was successfully mobilizing an entire community to view me as a predator. But the true storm was brewing much closer to home, inside the private family group text. Caroline and Preston had seen the Facebook post. For my older sister and younger brother, the revelation that Beatrice was facing eviction was not just a family drama. It was a direct threat to their own perceived inheritances. Caroline relied on our mother's status to elevate her own standing in her elite social circles. Preston leaned on the illusion of our family wealth to prop up his fragile ego and secure bad loans. The group chat notifications fired off in rapid succession, a relentless digital assault. Caroline sent a block of text accusing me of elder abuse. She demanded to know how I had managed to trick our mother into signing away the deed to the condo. She called me a thief, typing out furious paragraphs claiming I had always been jealous of the close relationship she shared with Beatrice. Preston chimed in seconds later. He did not ask for my side of the story. He called me a monster. He demanded that I rescind the legal notice immediately, threatening to drive to my house and force me to sign the property back over to our mother. They fired off dozens of messages, feeding off each other's panic, escalating their insults with every passing minute. They were terrified. If Beatrice lost her throne, the Golden children would lose their royalty by association. I stood at the kitchen island, watching the hateful words scroll across my screen, choosing to remain silent. I was letting them expend their ammunition. But then a quiet sound broke my concentration. I turned around. Avery was standing in the doorway connecting the kitchen to the hallway. She had just returned from school. She was holding her silver iPad in both hands, staring down at the glowing screen. Her knuckles were white. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her skin a pale, terrified shade of gray. Avery was still included in the family group chat. She was reading every single message Caroline and Preston were sending. She was reading the accusations of theft, the labels of monster and abuser, and the panicked demands for legal intervention. My daughter looked up at me, her eyes wide and brimming with sudden tears. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. The panic attack was setting in. "Mom, what is happening?" Avery whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely form the words. "Aunt Caroline says Grandma is going to be homeless. Uncle Preston says you are stealing her house. Did you do this because of Saturday night? Did you do this because of my cake?" The guilt in her eyes was agonizing. She was 16 years old, and she was attempting to shoulder the blame for the collapse of a toxic empire. She believed her desire to bake a dessert had triggered a catastrophic family war that was going to leave her grandmother sleeping on the street. Beatrice had conditioned her to believe she was a burden, and now Avery was assuming responsibility for the entire fallout. I did not let the panic take hold of her. I walked across the kitchen floor, closing the distance between us. I did not offer a frantic explanation or try to shout over her fear. I moved with calm, deliberate intention. I reached out and placed my hand gently over hers. I slid the iPad out of her rigid grip, lowering the screen so she no longer had to read the venomous words of her aunt and uncle. I guided her over to the kitchen table and pulled out a chair, pressing gently on her shoulders until she sat down. I knelt on the floor beside her, bringing my eyes level with hers. I needed her to understand the profound difference between the fiction being typed on that screen and the reality she was about to witness. "You did not cause this, Avery," I said quietly, ensuring my tone was steady and grounding. "You are not responsible for the consequences of other people's cruelty. Your grandmother is not a victim. Your aunt and uncle are panicking because the dark room they have been hiding in is about to have the lights turned on." Avery wiped a tear from her cheek, looking at me with fearful uncertainty. "But everyone is so angry," she murmured. "Everyone hates us now. How are you going to fix this?" I reached out and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I am not going to fix it," I told her. "I am going to end it." I picked up the iPad from the table. I looked at the screen, watching another furious message from Preston populate the chat, demanding an explanation for my silence. The tension of the public character assassination was reaching its peak. Beatrice had successfully painted herself as a martyr. Caroline and Preston were demanding a surrender. The country club was preparing a social execution. I tapped the screen, navigating away from the chat window. I opened my digital files application. I located the specific watermarked document my accountant had prepared for me a year ago during a routine business audit. It was a comprehensive financial summary, clearly detailing the ownership of the Lake Oswego property and the decade of subsidized payments flowing from my commercial accounts directly to Beatrice Clark. I sat down in the chair next to my daughter. I placed the iPad flat on the wooden table between us. "Watch how a house of cards falls," I said softly. I opened the family group chat. I did not type a defensive paragraph. I did not argue with Caroline or attempt to reason with Preston. I did not ask for an apology from anyone. I simply tapped the attachment icon, selected the single PDF document, and prepared to detonate the final bomb. I sat at the kitchen table, the smooth surface of the tablet cool beneath my fingertips. My daughter watched me, her breath hitching, bracing for another wave of digital vitriol. The group thread, affectionately titled Clark Family Updates, contained 15 active participants. It included my aunts, uncles, older cousins, and of course, my furious siblings. For the past hour, the notification chime had been a steady, hostile drumbeat. They were demanding my surrender, calling me a thief, and echoing Beatrice's false narrative of elder abuse. They believed they were backing a wealthy victim. They thought I was a rogue element trying to steal a family legacy. I tapped the attachment icon. I did not navigate to the photo gallery or the camera. I accessed the encrypted cloud drive connected to my floral boutique. I located the specific file my accountant had generated last tax season. The document was titled Beatrice Clark Financial Support Summary. It was a comprehensive 10-year ledger. It was not an emotional plea. It was a binding, irrefutable mathematical autopsy. I selected the file. It populated into the text field a small red document icon sitting beneath Caroline's latest unhinged demand for an explanation. Before hitting send, I wanted Avery to see exactly what I was doing. I tilted the screen so she could read the summary page. I pointed to the bold black numbers stamped across the white digital paper, each one carrying the official watermark of my limited liability company, paired with authentic routing stamps from our corporate bank. "Look at the columns," I instructed her, softly tracing the screen with my index finger. The top line item detailed the housing expense. $6,200 drafted on the first of every month, covering the mortgage insurance and maintenance for the Lake Oswego waterfront property. The deed was listed clearly in the name of my business. The second line item exposed the social facade. $1,200 paid directly to the country club billing department, subsidizing the elite luncheons and afternoon tennis matches. The third line item laid bare the transportation lie. $800 recurring every 30 days to keep the keys to a luxury sport utility vehicle inside my mother's designer purse. The grand total at the bottom of the final page was staggering. It represented a decade of silent labor, freezing mornings at the wholesale flower market, and deferred dreams. It was the exact price I had paid to keep my mother comfortable and my siblings willfully blind. Avery scanned the numbers, her brow furrowed. The fear in her expression slowly morphed into profound, quiet confusion. She'd grown up believing her grandmother was an independent financial titan. Looking at the ledger, she realized the titan was a hollow statue entirely funded by the woman sitting next to her. I tapped the text box beneath the attached file. I did not write a defensive essay. I did not engage with the accusations of elder abuse or address the theatrical Facebook post. Arguments suggest that the other party holds a valid perspective. I crafted a single, concise paragraph designed to sever the puppet strings permanently. Mom does not own the condo I typed, making sure every keystroke was deliberate. I do. I have paid for her entire life for a decade. On Saturday, she threw Avery's handmade cake in the trash and humiliated her. The Bank of Page is permanently closed. Anyone who feels sorry for her is welcome to pay her rent. I pressed the blue send arrow. The message appeared at the very bottom of the thread. The document thumbnail rested just above my words, an anchor dropping into a stormy sea. What happened next was the digital equivalent of a shockwave rolling through a crowded room. I placed the tablet flat on the wooden table, folded my hands in my lap, and watched the screen alongside my daughter. For the first 30 seconds, the chat remained active. Preston was in the middle of typing a new insult. The 3 gray animated dots danced on the screen, indicating his incoming rage. Then the dots vanished. He had received the file. He had opened the attachment. Below my message, tiny circular profile pictures began to populate in a neat horizontal row. They were read receipts, the undeniable footprints of a shattered illusion. One by one, the faces of my family members appeared. Aunt Diane read it. Uncle Richard read it. Caroline read it. Preston read it. Finally, Beatrice's portrait popped up at the end of the line. Every single person in that chat opened the ledger. Every single person read the text. The constant hostile drumbeat of notifications ceased. The kitchen grew incredibly quiet save for the low hum of the refrigerator motor. The silence stretching across that group chat was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Nobody typed a response. Nobody demanded further explanation. Math does not leave room for debate. The watermark verified the truth, and the column totals dismantled 30 years of curated superiority. I sat back in my chair, wrapping an arm around Avery's shoulders, feeling the rigid tension drain from her small frame. The secondary payoff was landing across 3 different area codes, striking my siblings with the force of a freight train. In her sprawling suburban house, Caroline was staring at her phone, experiencing a terrifying financial epiphany. My older sister had built her entire identity around being the favored heir to the Clark family fortune. She tolerated our mother's endless critiques and hosted lavish holiday parties because she believed a vast trust fund awaited her. Her husband, the struggling real estate broker, likely factored that imaginary inheritance into their own precarious debt management. She believed the waterfront property was a guaranteed asset she would one day liquidate. Staring at the file, Caroline realized the inheritance she was counting on to bail out her maxed-out credit cards was a ghost. The wealth did not exist. Across town, Preston was experiencing a similar, sickening freefall. My younger brother had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from Beatrice over the years, assuming he was merely taking early advances on a vast estate. He now understood that every dollar he had ever begged from our mother had actually originated from my floral studio. The realization that he had been relying on the sister he openly mocked to fund his reckless lifestyle was a bitter, inescapable pill. Their power was a mirage. Beatrice's authority was a fiction. The entire hierarchy of our family was a stage play, and I had just walked over to the fuse box and pulled the main breaker. The rapid shift in dynamics was breathtaking. I had stripped the golden children of their future, and I had stripped the matriarch of her past. Avery leaned her head against my shoulder. She looked at the silent screen, processing the sudden shift in gravity. The fear was entirely gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, dawning comprehension. "They are not saying anything," she noted, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have nothing left to say," I replied, closing the application and locking the screen. The truth is paralyzing when you have spent your whole life running from it. The smear campaign was effectively neutralized. The Facebook post was still live on the internet, gathering hollow sympathy from misinformed strangers, but the internal family war was over. The relatives who had been ready to crucify me were now sitting in their respective homes, trying to calculate the collateral damage to their own lives. Beatrice had weaponized her social network, assuming her children would fall in line to protect the inheritance. She had aimed her cruelty at my daughter, confident that her financial leverage would shield her from any real consequences. She had miscalculated the foundation of her own leverage, forgetting who actually held the purse strings. The sheer efficiency of the strike left the family paralyzed for the remainder of the afternoon. No one dared to call. No one dared to visit. They were trapped in the wreckage of their own shattered expectations, staring at a ledger that proved their superiority was subsidized by the very person they treated like dirt. However, the silence was only a temporary symptom of shock. The illusion of wealth had shielded Caroline and Preston from the burden of caring for a demanding, aging parent. With the Bank of Page formally shuttered, a new, terrifying reality was dawning on the Golden children. If Beatrice was truly broke, and if she was being evicted in 30 days, she was going to need a new place to live. She was going to need someone to buy her groceries, pay her mobile phone bill, and fund her salon appointments. I had abdicated the throne of the maintenance staff. The position was now permanently vacant. As the sun began to set over Portland, casting long shadows across my kitchen floor, I knew the real panic was just beginning to fester. My siblings were not going to reflect on their complicity or apologize for their terrible behavior. They were going to scramble to protect their own dwindling resources. The unearned loyalty they had shown our mother was about to be tested against the cold, hard cost of her survival, setting the stage for a betrayal much deeper than a ruined birthday cake. The fallout from the digital ledger did not end on Tuesday. The initial shock wore off overnight, replaced by the sharp, desperate calculus of survival. Wednesday morning brought the inevitable shift in the conflict. The battle was no longer between my mother and me. The war had moved to the siblings. I was standing in my floral studio arranging white hydrangeas for a weekend event when my phone rang. The caller identification displayed Caroline's name. 2 days ago, my older sister was typing frantic paragraphs accusing me of elder abuse. Today, the cadence of the ring felt entirely different. I answered the call, placing the device on speakerphone on the stainless steel work table while I continued to trim the stems. Caroline did not open with an insult. She opened with a panicked, breathless sob. My sister had built a life designed for a magazine cover. She was married to a commercial real estate broker whose primary talent was projecting success while quietly drowning in debt. They drove imported vehicles and hosted lavish charity dinners propped up by the unwavering belief that Beatrice possessed a vast estate that would eventually bail them out. Now Caroline was weeping into the receiver. She admitted a truth that stripped away the last remaining veneer of her superiority. Last month, Caroline and her husband faced a severe tax lien. They needed $20,000 immediately to prevent a public filing that would ruin his professional reputation. Beatrice had graciously written them a check, presenting the funds as a generous advance on their inheritance. Staring at the financial summary I provided the day before, Caroline had performed the terrifying math. She cross-referenced the dates. The $20,000 Beatrice handed her had been drawn directly from a sudden emergency repair deposit I had wired to the property management account for a fictional roof leak. I had funded my sister's tax bailout without even knowing it. "You cannot leave us with her," Caroline pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of her impending reality. "Mom called me this morning. She is talking about moving into my guest room. I cannot house her, Paige. We are barely keeping our own mortgage afloat. You know how demanding she is. She will expect us to cater to her every whim. She will criticize everything about my home. You have to reverse this. You have to pay the rent." Before I could respond, a second incoming call chimed on the screen. It was Preston. I tapped the screen, merging the calls together, allowing the two golden children to share the digital stage. Preston did not bother with tears. He bypassed sorrow and went straight to entitled demands. My younger brother lived in a sleek downtown loft, trading stocks with a reckless confidence subsidized by Beatrice's frequent cash gifts. "Fix this right now," Preston ordered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Mom just left me a voicemail. She said she is packing her bags and bringing her dog to my apartment. I do not have room for her. I am hosting investors this weekend. You are the one who caused this mess by cutting her off. You need to reinstate the bank drafts before she ruins my life." I stood over my work table holding a pair of floral shears. I listened to the two people who had spent my entire life treating me like the hired help. They were not angry that Beatrice was losing her home. They were terrified that she was becoming their financial burden. The loyalty they had paraded at the birthday dinner was a transaction, and the currency had just run out. They wanted the prestige of being the favorites, but they refused to pay the maintenance costs. I placed the shears down on the table. I leaned close to the microphone. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding calm. "You are both adults," I said. "You spent your entire lives worshiping a woman who threw my child's heart into a garbage bin while you sat there and drank her wine. You wanted the matriarch. Now you get to inherit the reality of her. Beatrice is your problem now. Do not ever contact me again." I did not wait for their protests. I tapped the red icon, ending the call. I opened my contact settings. I selected Caroline's name and engaged the block feature. I did the same for Preston. I found Beatrice in the directory and blocked her as well. It was a small physical action, just a few taps on a glass screen, but it severed the final toxic threads connecting me to my past. The maintenance staff had officially resigned. While my siblings were panicking in Portland, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding in Lake Oswego. The country club environment is a delicate ecosystem. It thrives on the perception of success and brutally quarantines any hint of financial failure. Word of the eviction did not stay quiet. It never does in those circles. The paralegal at my attorney's office had formally revoked the billing authorization for Beatrice's Platinum membership. By Wednesday afternoon, the club administration had discreetly updated their internal rosters. When Beatrice attempted to book her usual afternoon tennis court, a polite but firm club manager informed her that her account was suspended pending immediate payment of the initiation balance. The manager suggested she might want to clear up the matter before returning to the dining room. The gossip spread through the locker rooms and the manicured golf greens faster than a wildfire. The elite women who had rushed to defend her on social media just 24 hours earlier began to ask quiet, probing questions. Someone knew a clerk at the county courthouse. Someone else had a husband in corporate law. The truth about the deed ownership leaked into the social stream. Her friends discovered that Beatrice was not a wealthy widow being victimized by a greedy daughter. She was a dependent who had been evicted by her landlord. The social isolation was instantaneous. Rich socialites despise financial failure because it reminds them of their own vulnerabilities. Beatrice's phone stopped ringing. The invitations to charity galas and weekend brunches ceased. The women who had commented with praying emojis suddenly deleted their replies, eager to scrub their association with the scandal. The pristine reputation she valued more than her own granddaughter dissolved in an afternoon. By Wednesday evening, Beatrice logged onto her computer. She navigated to her own Facebook profile. She located the tearful, sprawling status update she had posted to rally the troops. With a few swift clicks, she deleted the entire post. The smear campaign vanished from the internet, swallowed by the profound shame of exposure. The family empire did not require my malice to fall. It collapsed under the crushing weight of its own incompetence. Beatrice, Caroline, and Preston had built a hierarchy based entirely on cruelty, enabled by a checkbook they did not own. When the checkbook snapped shut, the loyalty evaporated, and the polished executives turned on each other to survive. They were isolated in a prison constructed from their own bad choices. Standing in my quiet studio, looking at the blocked names on my phone, I felt a deep, resonant sense of justice. I did not need to ruin them. I only needed to stop saving them from themselves. The war was officially over, leaving the battlefield clear. The heavy lifting was done. It was time to sweep away the debris and set a brand new table for the people who actually belonged there. It has been 21 days since the digital ledger dismantled my toxic family tree. 3 weeks have passed since the certified eviction notice landed on the heavy mahogany door in Lake Oswego. The frantic voicemails ceased entirely. The hostile text messages from my siblings stopped arriving. The profound quiet that settled over my Portland home was initially terrifying to navigate. When you have spent 42 years bracing for incoming artillery, the sudden absence of conflict feels remarkably like a trap. I spent the first week jumping every time a delivery truck rattled past the front window, assuming my mother was arriving to demand her kingdom back. But she never came. The financial severance held firm. The boundaries I constructed out of sheer desperation calcified into a permanent, impenetrable fortress. Freed from the endless monthly financial drain, my commercial floral boutique experienced an immediate renaissance. I was no longer siphoning my profits to subsidize a luxury waterfront lifestyle. The capital remained securely in my business accounts. I authorized generous bonuses for my hardworking staff. I ordered premium imported blooms I had previously deemed too expensive for regular inventory. The crushing weight of underwriting another person's arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a vast, breathable space where my daily anxiety used to reside. My husband navigated this strange new reality with a quiet, profound dedication. The history teacher who previously shrank away from social friction finally stepped up to defend his own borders. David stopped suggesting we compromise. He stopped bringing up the cowardly concept of keeping the peace. Instead, he channeled his energy into repairing the trust he had fractured at the country club. He took over the household logistics, allowing me to focus entirely on the studio during the busy spring wedding season. He cooked dinner every evening. He reviewed geometry homework with our teenager. And he stood as a sturdy, immovable barrier between our front door and the outside world. He proved that a passive enabler can transform, provided they are willing to examine the ugly truth of their own cowardice and decide to be courageous. By the third Saturday of the month, the atmosphere inside our house had lightened enough to invite people back inside. We were hosting a dinner party. It was not a catered, formal affair designed to impress elite socialites. There were no engraved invitations or rigid seating charts. The guest list was comprised entirely of individuals who required zero performance. I invited Sarah, my loyal studio manager, along with 2 of our senior floral designers who had witnessed my exhaustion for years and always covered my shifts when family emergencies arose. Avery invited 3 of her closest peers from high school. These were teenagers who wore faded denim jeans, laughed unapologetically loud, and offered to help wash the dishes before the meal even began. They were a staggering contrast to my entitled nieces and nephews, who were trained by Caroline to demand service and complain about the menu. The dining room was chaotic, mismatched, and vibrating with authentic warmth. As the evening progressed, the fragrant scent of roasted chicken and garlic herb potatoes filled the air. Conversations overlapped, gracefully punctuated by bursts of joyous laughter. I stood near the kitchen island, pouring sparkling mineral water into glass tumblers, when my gaze drifted toward the head of the dining table. We had pulled an extra wooden chair from the basement storage to accommodate the extra guests. It sat in the exact physical location where Beatrice used to preside during our forced holiday gatherings. A sudden, involuntary flinch rippled through my chest. The phantom weight of my mother's judgment settled heavy on my shoulders for a fleeting second. My nervous system anticipated a sharp critique about the mismatched silverware or a condescending remark regarding the casual clothing my colleagues were wearing. That lingering trauma is the insidious tax you pay for surviving a narcissistic parent. The ghost of their disapproval haunts the empty spaces long after you change the locks and sever the bank accounts. I stared at the vacant wooden chair, feeling a cold sweat prickle the back of my neck. I braced myself for the invisible criticism. But the harsh words did not arrive. Instead, Sarah walked over and sat down in that very seat. She leaned back comfortably and recounted a hilarious story about a catastrophic wedding delivery involving a runaway golden retriever. The teenagers erupted into giggles. David smiled broadly, passing a large ceramic bowl of salad down the length of the table. The phantom anxiety evaporated entirely, replaced by the startling realization that my house was finally my own sanctuary. The air was breathable. The oppressive hierarchy was dead and buried. The climax of the evening arrived shortly after the dinner plates were cleared away. The swinging kitchen doors pushed open, but this time there was no gray plastic catering bin waiting in the shadows. Avery walked proudly into the dining room. In her hands, she carried a heavy glass pedestal stand. Resting on top was a brand new, slightly smaller lemon elderflower cake. She had spent Friday night baking the dessert from scratch, reclaiming the specific recipe that had been so viciously discarded weeks earlier. The sponge was covered in pristine, pale yellow buttercream. She had not attempted to recreate the fragile spun sugar flowers that shattered at the country club. Instead, she decorated the tiers with real edible blossoms she had carefully selected from my floral studio inventory. It was resilient, vibrant, and perfectly imperfect. As my 16-year-old daughter placed the glass stand squarely in the center of the wooden dining table, something miraculous occurred. I did not have to prompt a single person. I did not have to orchestrate a polite response to protect her feelings. The entire room spontaneously erupted into loud, thunderous applause. Her high school friends cheered vibrantly, banging their hands against the table surface in rhythmic support. The floral designers whistled. David stood up from his chair and clapped a broad, intensely proud grin stretching across his face. Avery blushed a deep shade of crimson, but the smile that broke across her face was radiant and pure. It was not the terrified, desperate smile she had worn while facing her grandmother. It was the secure, joyful expression of a child who knows she is entirely safe from rejection. The applause eventually faded into a warm, excited chatter. Avery picked up a silver serving knife. She sliced carefully through the soft layers, releasing the bright scent of citrus zest and toasted vanilla into the room. She slid the first piece onto a small porcelain plate. She did not serve the wealthiest guest first, because there were no social ranks to honor in this environment. She walked around the perimeter of the table, navigating past the loud conversations, and stopped right in front of me. She handed the porcelain plate directly into my hands. I looked down at the dessert. I looked up at the strong, beautiful young woman who baked it. She was entirely unburdened by the toxic family operating system. She did not have to calculate her worth based on a seating chart or a country club membership. She did not have to shrink her vast empathy to fit inside a luxury condominium. I took a bite of the cake. It tasted like undeniable victory. The healing in that room was a tangible, physical force pushing out the last remaining shadows of my past. It proved the final, ultimate truth that Beatrice never possessed the capacity to understand. True family has zero connection to shared bloodlines, elite status, or inherited wealth. True family is determined entirely by who treats you with compassion and warmth when the front doors are firmly closed. We sat at that mismatched table for hours, eating dessert and sharing stories, until the wax candles burned down to the glass. The empire I funded was gone, but the kingdom I built in its place was unbreakable. The peace I had searched for my entire life was not found by appeasing a tyrant. It was found by setting my own table and seeing exactly who showed up hungry for genuine connection. The story concludes 2 months later as the heavy Oregon rains finally gave way to the bright, clear skies of early summer. The legal dust settled over my family with a swift and permanent finality. When a relationship is governed by emotional manipulation, the battles can drag on for decades. But when a conflict is reduced to cold mathematics and property deeds, the resolution is remarkably brief. My attorney Thomas handled the remaining administrative details of the eviction without requiring my physical presence. Beatrice vacated the Lake Oswego property on the 29th day of her notice. I waited a full week before driving over to inspect the unit. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the foyer. The sprawling waterfront condo was empty, stripped of the curated luxury she had hoarded for a decade. She took her designer clothing, her expensive oil paintings, and the fine silver flatware. She left behind the bulky, heavy furniture she could not afford to move into a smaller space. Walking through those silent rooms felt like touring a museum after the exhibits had been dismantled. I stood in the center of the primary bedroom, the exact room she had once complained was insufficient for her vanity. The walls were bare, the hardwood floors were marked with faint scuffs from the moving crew. Stripped of her demanding presence and her endless complaints, the property was no longer an intimidating fortress of family authority. It was just drywall glass and a view of the water. Without my funding to sustain her illusion, her kingdom was nothing more than an overpriced piece of real estate. I hired a professional staging company to clear out the remaining debris and scrub the floors clinically, erasing every trace of her tenure. The Portland housing market operates with ruthless efficiency. We listed the property on a Thursday afternoon. The waterfront location attracted 3 competing offers by Monday morning. I did not negotiate for sentimental value. I accepted the highest cash bid and instructed Thomas to expedite the escrow process. I signed the closing documents on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I sat in a leather chair and watched the escrow officer stamp the final deed transfer. A few hours later, a substantial electronic deposit landed directly in my commercial banking ledger. I did not keep a single dollar of that return for my floral boutique. I did not reinvest it into inventory or warehouse space. Instead, I drove straight from the title office to my wealth manager's firm. We established a secure, irrevocable educational trust. Every cent of the equity pulled from that condo was deposited into a dedicated college fund for Avery. The young girl who stood in a commercial kitchen and watched her hard work slide into a gray plastic trash bin now possesses full tuition for any culinary institute in the world. The financial leverage that once sustained a tyrant now guarantees the future of a chef. When I showed Avery the trust documents, she did not say a word. She just wrapped her arms around my neck and held on tight, understanding that her future was no longer tied to her grandmother's approval. As for the antagonist of this story, the reality of her reduced circumstances arrived with staggering speed. Beatrice lost her Lake Oswego zip code, and in her social circle, losing your zip code is equivalent to losing your identity. Cut off from her country club and her wealthy facade, she expected her golden children to provide a seamless transition into another luxury arrangement. Caroline miraculously discovered a toxic mold issue in her guest bedroom, providing a highly convenient excuse to deny our mother shelter. The burden of housing the matriarch fell entirely onto Preston. My younger brother was forced to sign a lease for a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a loud, congested suburb miles away from the prestige of the lake. Preston now pays the monthly rent out of his own dwindling trading accounts. The local gossip network operates like a sieve, and word quickly reached my floral studio regarding his current disposition. Preston complains bitterly to anyone who will listen. He laments the soaring cost of her organic groceries, her relentless demands for salon treatments, and the suffocating reality of living under the same roof as her fragile ego. The golden child is finally learning the true grueling cost of maintaining the illusion. They are trapped in a prison of their own design, confined to a cramped living room filled with daily resentment and unpaid bills. They wanted the prestige of being the favorites. Now they get to pay the toll. The silence from that branch of the family held firm for 7 weeks. Then, on a random Thursday morning, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from an unregistered, unknown phone number. Beatrice had acquired a prepaid cellular device simply to bypass the digital block I had placed on her primary line. I opened the message. She did not send a sprawling paragraph of reflection. She did not offer a single ounce of remorse for discarding her granddaughter. She did not acknowledge the decade of financial support I had provided. The message contained exactly 5 words. I hope you are happy. It was a final, desperate attempt to inject guilt into my bloodstream. It was the parting shot of a woman who needed me to carry the weight of her downfall. She wanted me to read those words and feel the crushing burden of a daughter's obligation. I looked at the glowing text on the screen. I felt no anxiety. I felt no obligation. I felt a profound clinical closure. I did not type a response justifying my choices. I did not owe her a summary of my piece. I swiped my finger across the screen, deleted the message, and permanently blocked the new number. I look back at the 25 years I spent working as the translator for a toxic family. That is the true danger of the peacekeeper role. We take the sharp, cruel edges of our abusers and wrap them in soft excuses. We call their control high standards. We call their emotional manipulation a generational difference. We convince ourselves that if we just work a little harder, if we just pay one more bill, if we just bake a perfect cake, they will eventually see our value and grant us a seat at the table. We teach our children to ingest this poison and pretend it is medicine. We train them to accept the scraps thrown from the head of the table, teaching them that their own boundaries are less important than an elder's comfort. Keeping the peace is a dangerous myth. You are not keeping peace. You are merely internalizing the war so the abuser never has to feel the friction of their own behavior. My mother operated a family where love was treated as a scarce resource, distributed only to those who worshipped her aesthetic. I spent my entire adult life trying to purchase my way into her good graces, using my labor and my income to build a shield around her. But the shield became a weapon, and she used it to strike the most vulnerable person in my life. The moment she tipped that glass stand over the catering bin, she freed me from the illusion. You cannot fix a toxic dynamic by shrinking yourself to fit inside it. You cannot reason with a person who uses your empathy as a stepping stone. You cannot buy a seat at a table designed to keep you at the bottom. Sometimes, the only move is to flip the table entirely and build your own. That is the story of a 16-year-old chef, a decade of hidden ledgers, and a 30-day eviction notice that changed the trajectory of a family forever. Tell me in the comments the exact moment you stopped keeping the peace. Hit subscribe and remember, quiet women don't stay quiet forever.